welcome to our Ruta team. 25 years ago, I sat in a corner over here with my examination board sitting here, and it was a very tough PhD viva. So this place has wonderful memories for us, and so welcome to Ruta team. Now, I can see faces from my fourth year research writing class. Yesterday on our Facebook group, Adel Ahmed copied the tweet that Tom Healy tweeted on his account, and it said, "Looking forward to giving a lecture at Cairo University tomorrow on poetry and politics." So we've been looking forward to having you too. Welcome to Cairo, Tom. This is Tom's third time in Cairo. Welcome to the Department of English, to the Faculty of Arts. Now, there's also another tweet by Tom this time, and it says, "I'm reading from Animal Spirits," which is his second book, and he's reading some of his poetry at Kutub Khan on the 1st of April at 7 p.m. So if you're in Cairo, stop by. So you can meet Tom again at Kutub Khan on the 1st of April. So now Tom Healy. He is a poet, and it's wonderful to know that presidents, right, and specifically in that case President Obama, recruited a poet and a poetry specialist to become the chair of Foreign Fulbright. So this is wonderful. Suddenly, poets are important, and professors of poetry are important. Okay, so he's a writer, and if he writes poetry, he can write anything. And he's the chairman of Fulbright's Foreign Scholarship Board, which oversees the Fulbright program worldwide. And he has two books. What the Right Hand Knows is his first, and the second book is Animal Spirits. Now, he has many poems and essays that are published in many literary journals and anthologies. Now, Tom served as President Clinton's Presidential Advisory Council on HIV/AIDS. He worked around the world on AIDS and poverty programs. He owned one of the first contemporary art galleries in Chelsea. He served as president of the Lower Manhattan Cultural Council, and in 2006 he was awarded the New York City Arts Awards for leading the rebuilding efforts of the downtown arts community after 9/11. Now, help me in welcoming.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you, if I may be informal and call you Dr. Lubna. This is you talk about a room transformed, and it's always clear to me in teaching and being with gatherings of students that a room transformed is a room like this, with students and creative minds in it. So I'm happy to be in your mahogany room and to be with you in all this history and possibility. This morning I'm going to give a bit of a lecture on poetry and politics. And you'll have to forgive me that I don't speak Arab. So my familiarity with poems of contemporary Egypt and poems of the Arab world is all through translation. And it's my loss. So in the questions and answers, you'll be able to correct my mistakes and help teach me a bit. So how many of you know what a jasmine flower smells like? If you close your eyes, can you smell it? The smell. Do you remember the smell? Yes. And you know a jasmine flower only opens at night, when the temperature gets cooler and the sun sets. The small white flowers look like stars, in fact, I saw last week on the Upper Nile on the ceilings of so many tombs there. And have any of you seen jasmine flowers when they are picked to make jasmine oil? Yeah. It's a fascinating thing because the flowers are so fragile, different from the scents for many other flowers. It's very hard to pick them. You have to pick them at night when the scent is strongest, so it's in the dark. People pick them, and they lay out these fragile flowers on sheets of cotton. They're soaked with olive oil. And then the flowers sit in the oil for many days. And then each one has to be picked out of the oil again. The oil is strained, and that bears the jasmine scent that becomes so valuable. I actually visited a jasmine oil factory here in Egypt last time I was here. It was an extraordinary thing to see. I've been thinking about jasmine a lot lately. This week, many students were killed at the university in Damascus, which many of you probably know is called the city of jasmine. This week, I was talking with a number of women here who were fearful of their children in the revolution. Jasmine is a flower of motherhood. And this week I was reading the poems of your fellow student at this great university, Mohammed al-Ajami. As you know, al-Ajami is in prison in Qatar. He's in prison for a poem he wrote called Tunisian Jasmine, a name that outsiders, not the Tunisians themselves, but outsiders have given to their revolution. And last month, his sentence was reduced from life to 15 years. 15 years for a flower. 15 years for a human life as delicate as a flower. 15 years for the flowers that are words, which are poetry. I want to talk a bit today about words and their power. And I want to talk about the strange bedfellows that are poetry and politics. They're relatives, these two things, but their relations are what we call in the United States a dysfunctional family. Just 2 weeks ago, the third Cairo International Poetry Encounter was held. I wasn't there. Was anyone here? Did anyone go? I read about that. There were speeches and readings and debates and boycotts. There was a timeless distrust of different generations who participated or didn't. There were debates of what's treasured and well known in poetry and what's new and strange. In many ways, what I read of this poetry encounter seemed less about politics and poetry than the politics of poetry, which is perhaps a much smaller thing we also have in the United States between different kinds of poetry at schools, different universities, between young people and older poets. But during this, reading about this poetry encounter, I was particularly struck by the comments of one young poet, Mahmoud Qurani, who said that the committee that planned the encounter, he was angry about it because they included so many older and traditional and well-known poets and not younger poets or people who wrote differently. And he said that the committee is living outside history. I'd like you to imagine that for a minute. Who lives outside of history? Even if you're largely a spectator to events, far from the protests of or from Tahrir, are you, or is any of us ever really an outsider? And who decides in and out? There's a critic in the United States named Andrew Janon who does speak Arabic and was writing a poem about poetry in this moment, and he called it The Emergency of Poetry, which is a play on the title of a very famous poet by a great American poet, Frank O'Hara, called Meditations in an Emergency. O'Hara wrote his poem in 1954, before your parents were even born, I imagine, for most of you. But there was no political emergency in America, in New York at the time. In O'Hara's poem, there was only the emergency of him jokingly believing his eyes were the wrong color, that he was bored, that he was full of erotic possibility but not satisfied. But are those not emergencies that he writes about? He says in the poem, very famously, I am the least difficult of men. All I want is boundless love. Imagine that idea. It's a brilliant conceit. Just boundless love. Just something simple. Love all the time from everyone. It actually sounds like most poets I know. I'm perfectly reasonable. All I demand is everything. It sounds like a lot of people in politics too, right? In this essay about poetry and emergency, Janan asks a question that always gets asked. What good is poetry in a time like this? The first thing one might ask is, what is this time? How do we know the time we're in? Are we in that time or out? Are we part of history, and what does that mean? I think art, first of all, always helps us struggle with those questions. That we have to slow down and ask, what is this place and time? But in any event, Janan rehearses two arguments that are pretty well known. The first is that poetry is politically useless, and that's its strength. W.H. Auden, a famous British and then American poet, said that poetry makes nothing happen, and therefore freed of the urgency to engage in political action and be responsible for something, a poet is free to be an artist. And then the other argument that Janan contemplates is that poetry has a powerful, urgent political function in that it can expose ideologies, speak truth to power, to give a voice to powerless people, and it can be a call to action, that it can counsel and console people. But he looks very powerfully in his lecture to see, well, that kind of definition of poetry, one that in a moment of revolution feels like, yes, that's the poetry we need and should have. He says, how is that different from just good political speech? The idea that you need someone to console, someone to counsel, someone to call us to action. How do you make a distinction that that's poetry versus politics? I'll never forget when Barack Obama was first running for president. The president and I are friends. We are one day apart in age. He looks much younger. Well, he used to get before he became president. But so we've been friends a long time. But when he was first running for president, what people were so struck by, and I think people in Egypt and the rest of the world who remember from the speech he gave here, people were struck by his great eloquence. And that eloquence made many Americans very wary of him. And I'll never forget there was a union boss at a rally for Hillary Clinton in Ohio when President Obama and Hillary Clinton were running against one another. And this union boss was an advocate for factory workers. He supported Hillary Clinton and not Barack Obama. He said, "Give me a break. I've got news for all the latte drinking, Prius driving, Birkenstock wearing, trust fund babies crowding in around to hear Obama speak. So you can have a picture of what kind of liberal American he is mocking that he thinks supports Barack Obama. He said, this guy won't last a round against the Republicans. They'll kill him. He's a poet, not a fighter. I'll never forget that dismissal of poetry. There are two assumptions in it, right? One, that poetry is passive and spoiled and out of touch. It doesn't know how to fight and get things done. Whereas politics is active, messy, aggressive. It's a fight. It's like a war. And yet, there are constant confusions between these two because politicians are often the very same people who will deride poetry. Politicians often describe the highest moments of political life as poetic. Think of Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, or Martin Luther King and his I Have a Dream speech. And then at other times, like that union official, they dismiss poetry as empty talk. But interestingly, politics and poetry, so much of the time, are actually both mostly about talk. Think of how much political talk you listen to in this country. It's tempting to think that poetry and politics are a lot alike because of this, because they're both about rhetoric and persuasion, about values. They both, we like to think in America, use words more than bodies. But do they? Because it's bodies that face tear gas, and it is Muhammad al-Jami's body that's in prison. In the English literary tradition, two poets stand out for their engagement in debate about poetry and politics. I mentioned one, W.H. Auden, and the other famously is the Romantic poet Percy Shelley. Shelley famously said that poets are the mirrors of the gigantic shadows which the future casts upon the present. Poets are the unacknowledged legislators. Right? But remember the first part of that famous quote, and it's actually even longer than this. It said, poets are the mirrors of the gigantic shadows which the future casts upon the present. So it's interesting. So he's saying it's like that poets see the future, but they're actually seeing shadows of the future. Better perhaps than most people see, but not as though they're clairvoyant. But W.H. Auden was much more skeptical, and he said, let me read his quote a little bit at length. All poets, and he's a bit mocking when he says this, so think about that. All poets adore explosions, thunderstorms, tornadoes, conflagrations, ruins, scenes of spectacular carnage. The poetic imagination is not at all a desirable quality in a statesman. In a war or a revolution, a poet may do very well as a guerrilla fighter or a spy, but it is unlikely that he will make a good regular soldier, or in peacetime, a conscientious member of a parliamentary committee. He's making fun of how dramatic and emotional poets are, saying we'd be bored by being Shelley's legislators. But he's actually agreeing with Shelley on a fundamental point. He is saying, like Shelley, that poetic thinking is essentially apocalyptic. That poetry involves a kind of totalizing the vision to which everything, even the poet him or herself, becomes subordinate. Shelley thinks this vision is good and to be trusted. Auden is skeptical and thinks that apocalyptic, thrilled, dramatic, romantic vision of a poet is to be mistrusted. But they both believe that's how poetry and the poetic imagination work. Dramatic, romantic, wildly generalizing. And this is how poetry can be like politics when we think of politics itself as more than legislating. When in moments of transformation, powerful change, or revolution, that politics itself is about creating vision and reimagining people and their culture. And any brand of politics, so even whether it's absolute or dramatic, or even more moderate and parliamentary, politics always has a vision that supports and sustains it. And so you'll find poets of every political stripe. Because even if that political belief, that vision is modest and conservative, favors those in power, there are going to be poets and artists who support that kind of vision. There are other going to be poets whose vision is such dramatic change. There are going to be voices, take voices of women in this culture where so many dramatic writing is happening that we get translated into America. Those are new voices and a vision of change, not a conservative vision. But both can be poets. Some better, some worse. But here's where the complication is. In America, the dominant form of poetry is what we call, and most of you have studied in studying American and British literature, is the lyric. Like a song, the lyric poem has become something I describe as something self-enclosed. It's about a singular voice. It doesn't need to be the voice autobiographically of the poet, him or herself, but it is a voice that's usually speaking largely to itself in meditative solitude. It's a voice, there's often some insistence about it, but it's insisting on the space for privacy, the space for some solitude. Why has this happened in American poetry? Well, I'd like you to listen to what Tocqueville, famous French political theorist, wrote after a long trip in America. And he wrote a famous book called Democracy in America. This is from a Frenchman's point of view, French Revolution happening, and a questioning of, do we want to switch from a system of monarchy to a system of democracy? And what are the differences between a culture that has an aristocracy, people, and tradition, and a system that is going to be a free-form, unclear, open-ended democracy? And he said, not just about American democracy, but about democracy in general. Tocqueville said, not only does democracy make every man forget his ancestors by saying we're creating something new on our own, but democracy hides his descendants, people who come after him, and separates his contemporaries from him. It throws him back forever on himself alone. Because in democracy, the vote is yours. The interests, at best, other than your own, that you stand for are your small family and community, but it's your vote. One person, one vote. How concerned are you about the past? How concerned are you when, in America, we look at spending and spending on our current selves and don't think about the debt we're incurring for our future? So he says it throws him back, the citizen, the democratic citizen, forever upon himself alone, and threatens in the end to confine him entirely in the solitude of his own heart. To be honest, that sounds a lot like poets I know in America. It sounds a lot like what frustrated Mahmoud Karani about poets living outside history. So, if our lyric poetry is somewhat a function in America of centuries of this individualism, if we keep insisting on our right to privacy, insisting on a kind of inner urgency in that, all these centuries later, we American writers must be insisting to someone, right? The act of insisting, which is essential to American poetry, necessarily implies that there's someone you're insisting this to. And that's what creates a struggle for American poets. The absence of a real audience for this inward lyric poetry. The failure of performance, because so many poets have very limited audiences. Those engender, I think, an anxiety in myself and my friends and other writers, a kind of bad conscience about what we do, a sense of our possible irrelevance, impotence, and unreality of what poetry is up to. But we still believe in this inner description of the life of a person thinking in moments outside time and history. It just becomes our anxiety about its relevance in the world. So a struggle to get out of ourselves, to be engaged in something larger, a struggle for community, a struggle to be inside history. I think that's not just the great struggle of American poetry, but it's a great struggle of American culture right now, the American soul. And perhaps it is the opposite, right now at least, of the soul of a poet in revolution. It seems to me that the place for poetry, the place for art, maybe is a meeting place between these different kinds of souls. Soul of solitude needs the volume turned up, to be broken out of its own solitude. But perhaps, maybe it makes sense, it's a question I can't answer, for artists in times of revolution to turn down volume, to see also the solitude, individual voices within revolution and change, to see something at least acceptable in times of emergency about stealing a moment away, to breathe, to be quiet, to be momentarily outside history. I can't really answer that. It's an ongoing debate, and I'm certainly not in a culture of dramatic change. I'm in a culture that I think is more accused of decadence and stagnation. And that's our own urgency to deal with, but a different one from your own. So I can't answer that truly, though I do feel that somewhere in the middle might be a path for our poems to learn from one another. But what I do know is that our poems, our actual art, will have their own lives with or without us. If you look in the history of poetry, both Arab and English, there are political poems that, when they're read later, may have no relevance to the people reading them. Or, strangely enough, they get read as a love poem. And then there are love poems, personal, inward poems, that get transformed into political emergencies. The irony is, W.H. Auden had a very famous poem that after 9/11 got read in exactly this way. Right? America. So that critic, Andrew Jonas, whom I spoke of earlier, said that poetry in times of emergency is probably best not poetry of anger or solitude, but what he called poetry of lament. Here's how he distinguishes lament, which is air of melancholy and sadness and retrospection, looking backward. Here's how he distinguishes it, lament from anger. The lament, no less than anger, refuses to accept the fact of suffering. But while anger has some urgent reason, something right now to cause us to be angry, he says the lament has a universal cause and rises, these are his words, undiminished through millennia of cultural mediation. Unlike anger, the lament survives translation into silence, into ruin. All of us lament loss, lament our own limitations and weakness and failure. And all of us, despite our political differences, can share in both joy missing and the sadness lived that a lament embodies. So I'd like to end with two poems I think express this issue from very different perspectives, old and new, Western and Arab, two forms of lament. The first is a very famous English sonnet by Wordsworth, probably many of you know by heart. The world is too much with us, late and soon, getting and spending. We lay waste our powers. Little we see in nature that is ours. We have given our hearts away. A sordid boom. The sea that bears its bosom to the moon, the winds that gather up howling at all hours, and are upgathered now like sleeping flowers. For this, for everything, we are out of tune. It moves us not. Great God, I'd rather be a pagan suckled in a creed outworn, so might I, standing on this pleasant lea, have glimpses that would make me less forlorn. Have sight of Proteus rising from the sea, or hear old Triton blow his wreathed horn. He's talking about the boredom, the materialism, the urbanity of a culture in England at the time, Western culture, that has forgotten nature, but is also a culture that's forgotten to look beyond itself. He's frustrated by a poetry of solitude. And finally, here's an excerpt from Sadi Yusuf's Nostalgia of My Enemy. Is poetry merely a reading of life? I believe it's vaster and more deep than that. Humans have numerous ways of reading their lives, including science and politics. But poetry is a different matter. If science and political struggle promise and prepare for another time, poetry is current, direct, and immediate. I mean that poetry's ability to read, participate, and change is more effective and deeper in the veins. Poetry is transformative. Thank you.